And welcome back. Now, Health Minister Dr. Joe Phaahla has given striking members of trade union Nehawu until this morning to return to work or face the risk of disciplinary action. Now, he has welcomed the Labour Appeal Court's judgment, which interdicts Nehawu's members from actually continuing with their wage strike. And of course, we've seen how this has played out over the past 2 weeks. And the union is now demanding a 10% wage increase, while government is offering 4.7%. And Labour Consultant Tony Healy joins us now to unpack the latest in these developments. Tony, good to have you with us. Thanks so much for coming through.
Good morning, Sakina.
Let me start with your assessment of how things have played out so far.
Well, I think unfortunately we all predicted that the strike would be violent, as it has been. It's also unprotected. It's unlawful. And we've come to expect, unfortunately, this kind of behavior from many trade unions over a number of years.
So in this instance, you know, some would say that neither side has covered themselves in any sort of glory. Government, for their part, should have anticipated that this would possibly play out. And on the part of the unions, they also could have done better to ensure that other people's rights and lives are protected, as it were.
Well, yes, I think from a union perspective, there's no doubt that there are a large number of vacancies. I mean, my understanding is there are over 200,000 vacancies in the junior levels within the public sector. So there's a lot of strain on staff. But the fact of the matter is the law is the law. And when it comes to essential services, yes, on the one hand, one has a right to strike, but you have to weigh up that right against, for example, the right to public health. And that's what our law does. And it says in certain circumstances, certain positions, you may not strike because it's not in the national interest. And yet the strike has gone ahead. And that's problematic. And not only did it go ahead, the fact that it was interdicted was challenged, which I believe is also unacceptable. It has no prospects of succeeding. You can't miraculously transform an unlawful strike into a lawful or protected strike.
Is the law explicit enough in terms of, curtailing the rights of essential workers when it comes to strike action?
Yes, it is, and it's well drafted, that section of the Act. It's in line with what you'd find in any other so-called Western democracy, which says, in as much as the right to strike is enshrined in the Constitution, as I say, it must be weighed up against the right of the general public to access health. And you know, those vocations, for example, are clearly demarcated. I mean, if you are a cleaner or a janitor in the health sector, then you're not declared an essential worker. But if you are a nurse, you are.
So government has said no work, no pay. That principle would apply, but then that hasn't seen anything slowing down in terms of the members of Nehawu coming out to actually protest, and they have said that other people who may not necessarily be members of Nehawu have actually joined in the strike. So how is government going to enforce this, do you think?
Well, the Labour Court order to return to work is very important and must be complied with. And my understanding is that Nehawu is going to comply with the instruction to communicate this outcome to their members so that they return to work. We're hearing utterances from the ministry that those strikers that don't return to work will face disciplinary action, and ultimately they can face dismissal. The question arises, of course, how do you dismiss, tens of thousands of nurses, for example, and where do you replace, what stock do you have to replace them? So it'll be interesting to see how things develop. And also there's the question of the strike-related misconduct and the mayhem that we've seen, because there should be disciplinary action taken against anyone who's misbehaved during the strike, as we've seen.
Again, how is government going to enforce this? Because we know of instances where striking members have gone into hospital facilities, wards, beaten up, dragged out those members who were not on strike. Again, one would imagine that there should be consequences, but would government be bold enough? Would they be brave enough to actually enforce that?
Well, their first task is to have the evidence. So in any strike-related misconduct, the principal issue often is identifying the culprits. So you do need evidence, and you do need enough proof that they committed these acts. And once you have this proof, then you are in a position to take the necessary action against them. It'll be interesting to see what the ministry does, because we've had this widespread mayhem. And if they had their contingency plans in place, that should have included, for example, close monitoring, video scrutiny of behavior, so that post the strike, when you revisit those incidents, you're able to identify the perpetrators and bring them to book.
So what about the deaths that have occurred? And I was saying to you off air that the Minister, Dr. Joe Phaahla, last week had essentially admitted that there were at least 4 deaths that were directly attributable to this particular strike. So one would imagine that there's likely to be some litigation that flows from that. And this could cost the department quite a packet.
Yes, but that's a long road and a difficult road to be taken when it comes to apportioning blame for the deaths. I mean, I think one can make a presumption, but to prove the causal link between the strike and the deaths is something that, from a legal perspective, is complex and would take quite some time. As is the case with any strike-related misconduct cases, and as is the case when you're dealing with, for example, a claim for damages or compensation for the conduct of a trade union during a strike like this. So we do have precedent for compensation and damages against trade unions, but if you look at those cases, they're long cases, they're protracted cases, and it takes a lot of time.
When you say against the trade unions, who ultimately pays? Is it the trade unions or is it government?
Well, the trade union has to pay. So we have precedent in previous strikes, for example, where unions have compensation awards have been granted in favor of trade unions, and damages claims have been granted, in favor of employers, and damages claims have been made in favor of employers, and the trade unions themselves have had to pay up.
So we look at where we are now, and clearly this impasse is far from over. Let's assume that the workers go back today. Where does that leave us still with regard to resolving that impasse? Because government is still saying, 4.7%, the unions are demanding 10%, and they're still quite far apart.
Look, all strikes come to an end eventually, and everybody goes back to work, and stability to a degree is restored. But we're not quite at the end of the road in this particular case, because there is still further aspects of the appeal of the original interdict to be addressed. But the fact that the Labour Appeal Court has enforced this preliminary interdict, if you like, is very important. But in time, things will stabilize. Whether, of course, it'll address the underlying tension that exists, time will tell. But I think we certainly can expect that in the foreseeable future, the public sector workers will return to work.
And speaking of that underlying tension, if you look at how things were dealt with last year, and it was obvious that this year it was going to be a lot more combative, it was going to be a lot more hardlined given how things played out last year, and it wasn't a surprise when it came to what we are seeing now. So from government's perspective, again, surely they couldn't think possibly of going the way they did last year.
Well, if you look across the globe, actually, we went through a period of COVID where there was no industrial action. We've had the consequences of COVID. We've had the cost of living crisis, which is kind of an existential economic problem globally. You've got the fact that the 3-year public sector deal was not fully implemented in the last deal. So yes, I think you're right. Government had to have expected a backlash of this ilk. It still doesn't make the behavior acceptable. We need to...
No, it isn't. And I think we should draw a clear distinction.
Yes.
The behavior is not acceptable, but government is not blameless. in what is happening here. They need to accept some form of culpability for where we find ourselves. For one, you mentioned, for example, the fact that the vacancy rate within some of the public sectors, it's unacceptably high, which means there's a lot of pressure on the employees in those sectors, and you can only imagine how frustrated they must be.
Absolutely right. And, you know, we hear the comment that the public sector is bloated. Well, the public sector is not bloated in the important areas. Nurses, policemen and women, educators. Where it's bloated is at the more senior levels, the sort of quasi-political positions, the senior executive positions. That's where it's bloated. That's where you see the excessive remuneration and the excessive benefits. And as I say, you have, my understanding is there are over 200,000 vacancies in the more junior positions. So yes, if you're a policeman, a woman, or a teacher, or a nurse, you're under immense pressure because of the moratorium on employment, and because of the fact that, in my view, too much is spent on executives and benefits and too little is spent on the those members of staff at the lower levels who are on the ground, you know, rendering the services to me and you on a daily basis.
So one can understand that frustration without necessarily accepting the poor behavior that follows through the strike action, but one understands the frustration. And also, when you look at when the executive looks at their own remuneration, and you see increases being granted, and I know people will argue that, hey, we're talking about two separate entities, but in the end, we're talking about the same public purse, if you will, if we're going to split hairs about it, Tony. And therefore, people see it as such, that if the president, the executive, judges, and, you know, all those other people at the higher echelons of society are going to get increases, why can't we get increases and proper increases at the lower end of that scale?
Well, I think that's right. And when the government talks about growing levels of inequality, I think they need to look at themselves, because that inequality is growing within the public sector itself. We should be paying, in my view, we should be doubling the salaries, not 10%, not 4%. We should be doubling the salaries of policemen and women, nurses and teachers, because they play such a vital role in society. So I agree with you. I mean, I can fully understand the frustration. The dilemma is, how do you vent that frustration in a way that is going to help you achieve your objectives and maintain a degree of decorum and civility in trying to resolve this dispute.
So where to from here, Tony? You know, what in your view needs to be done on both sides of this divide?
Well, I think on the one hand, government needs to address the number of vacancies. One needs to address the working conditions of nurses, teachers, policemen and women. Absolutely need to address that. They can and they should. From the union members' perspective, they need to comply with the law. They absolutely have to comply and recognize that that's something they have no alternative but to do. And to ensure that the small percentage, because it is a small percentage of the strikers that are misbehaving, that they are brought to book and that they improve their discipline in these kinds of situations, because the behavior in some quarters has been terrible. But again, I think it would be wrong to cast all strikers in the same light. It's a small percentage, but of course we see those in the headlines. So I think both parties have work to do in terms of getting their houses in order.
Tony, we'll leave it there. Thank you so much. Labour Consultant Tony Healy on the latest industrial action that we are currently seeing in the government sector.